Hey peeps, it's Tripl-L, and now let's talk Shokugeki no Soma, or Food Wars, Chapter 196, He Who Leads the Charge. Now, following with the trend today, this chapter is also pretty nice. It's pretty surprising. It's pretty much a full-on, why is Joichiro the way he is, or why was he the way he is, his rise into the title known as Asura. And now, this chapter is done very nicely. There's a lot of information going on in this chapter, whether it be through a flashback within a flashback, or just Saiba, his general actions themselves. So I'm actually pretty excited to talk about this. So the crux of this chapter, like the really big question is, or not question, the big thing you can get from this chapter is, what ultimately drove Saiba to be what he became? And you know, I think it's a multi-stage problem. In the previous chapter, we did see, I guess, Gourmet Elite, the way that they put pressure on Saiba to kind of continue trailblazing. And also maybe they also showed this lack of appreciation. In this chapter, it becomes a bit more defined what's going on. And ultimately what you as a reader interpret this chapter to be in terms of his motivation as to why he became the Asura, you know, I think would be equally valid, because there's a lot of interpretations you can take out of this chapter as to why Saiba is what he is. Here's what I'm thinking. So we have the establishment that Saiba saw how the Gourmet Elites don't really care about his cooking. They don't really enjoy his cooking the first time. They just look to what's ahead. And that seems to be pressuring him, because in this chapter we do see that he does take trailblazing seriously. So that part of the last chapter does seem to affect him. In this chapter it becomes more pronounced. And now the big question, or the big thing that you have to apply here, is figuring out what's happening in his mind as he's doing things. So in this chapter we do see that when he goes back to the Polar Star dorm, when he's cooking with Gin and Azami, we do see that he smiles again. I think that's a very important segment. He smiles, saying that the Polar Star dorm is the best. And this is important because later on in the chapter we get to see a flashback. Right when Saiba is at the pinnacle, when he's just become the Asura, we see that in the contest that he had gone to, the one that he had right before he had his Shokugekis with Gin and Azami, we saw that one of his opponents just kind of gave up at the beginning because he couldn't deal with a genius. And so the thing with the genius becomes the theme of this chapter. So he couldn't deal with the genius, and he took that, Saiba being a genius, as being the reason he lost. And then when you contrast it to Gin in the earlier part of the chapter, you see that ultimately Gin doesn't see Saiba as a genius. He just sees his own shortcomings where he could have improved. And I think that's what Saiba wants the most, right? It's not just the fact that he's a genius. And ultimately, he might not really be a genius in the sense that everyone else is saying he is. Ultimately, like, the journey of cooking, you know, I think it ultimately comes back to, like, he wants to see people appreciate cooking more. And when that doesn't happen, it makes him angry. And we see that he got angry later on in the climax of this chapter. So, you know, that's one aspect of it. And it's pretty cool. That the use of that flashback later on and dropping that it was the tournament that he had just returned from adds a lot of context to what's going on in Saiba's mind, I think. And it ultimately all comes to a climax when we get that one rich dude who's really sour and salty over Saiba being better than him, challenging him to a Shokugeki, and then Saiba doing his thing where he takes on a 50-man army in the equivalent of a food war. Oh yeah, right, that's what they do, food wars. Anyway, that was pretty brutal, and I really like what the character says about this. I'll just repeat what Manga Stream has for the translation. Despite having zero inkling of just how difficult it is trailblazing you past, you dare dismiss me as just a genius. Must be nice to be so carefree, huh? And then, you know, he asked him, did you really shout at me to cook seriously? So that's interesting. And it's specifically interesting because this idea of hard work and genius has been a theme in Shokugeki no Soma from a while ago. I'll talk about that at the end, but this idea that Saiba's presenting in this particular panel, it's cool. It's a really cool idea because it does say that ultimately Saiba might not be a genius. He might just have a general knack for being able to come up with things. We know that in this chapter, this rich boy, pretentious boy, he kind of told us what Saiba was making, that they were weird combinations, that no one could think of this, and he attributed that to the mark of a genius. Whereas Gin, he gave us this perspective that Saiba's been starting his weird habit of trying different weird combination cooking. The weird combination cooking is what lets Saiba do this kind of thing now, because now he's really breaking the boundaries of what was considered normal, and to do that he needs to know what doesn't work and what does. So this is a pretty cool sequence, because we as the reader know that he might actually be putting in a lot of work, and then to have his opponents come up to him and just dismiss him as a genius, to pretty much make all of his hard work mean nothing, and it's more of a, yeah, I'm just good at this, and that they can't naturally overcome that. That must be infuriating to him. And then when we go back to the beginning of the chapter and we see what he said about the Polar Star Dorm, that the Polar Star Dorm is the best, I do think he means that legitimately. People like Gin, who would lose and still see where they could have improved to take him down later on, might be the people that he respects more, because he respects the work that they put into their craft, and they respect the work that Saiba puts in. I think it ultimately comes back to respect. It's respecting the work that goes into your passion. And when these people who just dismiss their work as inferior to a natural genius, that might rile Saiba up to an extreme degree. And it does seem like he's pretty bitter that people aren't recognizing that trailblazing is hard and he's trying his best, and everyone's just dismissing it. Oh, he's just a genius. And you know, on that note, the last page of this chapter, this is just kind of bothering me. It ends off with saying the genius awakened. And it's just funny because the whole chapter leading up to that point was about Saiba maybe not being a genius. Like, his hard work is not just attributed to him being a genius. And you know, I'm pretty sure that when it comes to those last minute blurbs in a chapter like the Genius Awakened, I'm pretty sure that's what the editorial department puts in there. I think that's what Bakuman taught me. I think that's how it works. Those last minute blurbs are things by the editorial department. Because then I think if that's the case, and if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but if that's the case, the Genius Awakened line, that is just, I think, it just doesn't flow well with the idea that this chapter is presenting. And yeah, you know, whatever. Anyway, other things that were happening during the whole Asura thing were that we saw that Azami fell in love with this version of Saiba. So now the question is, what does he consider the ruined version of Saiba? It must be after the Asura. Does he see this Asura Saiba as the pinnacle of gourmet, and then whatever happened to him afterward being his downfall? So, you know, that makes sense. If it's the diner life, if the diner life is what ruined Saiba in his eyes, then it makes sense why he has a vendetta against diners. But yeah, it was just cool to see that this might be the point where Azami fell in love with his master. Anyway, you know, it's a very cool chapter. Overall, there are things that we know because of things that happen in the future. We know that most likely he's not going to get better during his time in school. He's probably going to leave, because we know from Fumio that when she saw Saiba again, she made the remark that he learned how to cook with kindness again. Or learned how to cook with kindness in general. So we can suppose that he's not getting fixed for his remainder time in Totsuki. He's getting out of there relatively soon, and that's unfortunate. Now let's talk about how Soma is different from Saiba, and let's talk about this theme of hard work versus genius. Because it's hard to actually see, or hard to word the parallel, because with Saiba we have a situation where this guy might be naturally talented, but he also puts in work on top of the talent in order to expand his cooking, and he's putting in a lot of work. That's the pinnacle of his anger. It's just people don't value the work that they put in, and they don't value the work that he puts in. They're just seeing the food for what it is and attributing all their failures due to Saiba just being better. When we transition over to the Soma situation, and we've got this talk from Nishiki and we got it from Saiba back during the autumn elections, I think. And it might be interesting because Nishiki might be on the path that Saiba is on to a degree, because back in that time we had a conversation about Soma being the one to show all the other students in Todoroki that they can beat genius. Soma is the one that goes in there, he puts in the work. He's the person that people don't see as talented. He's just a loudmouth. And when they see him work, actually winning against people like Alice, who might be certifiably genius when it comes to their craft, Nishiki did point out that it would make the student body have to recognize that they're not putting in hard work. So it's a very different thing that's going on. Where Saiba wasn't getting his work recognized, Soma is actively forcing people to acknowledge that they can win if they work hard. And I like that conversation a lot, because Nishiki points out that if people acknowledge Soma, they ultimately have to acknowledge that they're not trying hard enough. And that's a really interesting idea, and it's interesting to see these kind of parallels developing between father and son. Now, we do know that Soma is very different from Saiba, and that's that failure doesn't deter Soma. It makes him work harder. Whereas for Saiba says that's something not many people have, and most likely he doesn't have it. So chances are this guy hasn't encountered failure in what he, or at least what he would traditionally classify as failure during his high school days. He hasn't probably encountered it, which would be interesting. Whereas Soma is someone who constantly encounters failure because of having to go up against people who are more skilled than him, but then he takes that and he sees that he can still reach their level if he puts in more work. And so, you know, it's a very interesting theme that develops between Soma and his father. And, you know, ultimately, I like this is pretty much why I love the chapter. It's because it's coming back to that theme of hard work versus genius, and we're seeing two different sides of it. Whereas Soma is about forcing people to acknowledge that hard work does win out against genius in some cases. Saiba's is more of a, guys, acknowledge that even if I'm a genius, I'm putting in hard work, and you can't take that away from me by just slapping on a label and giving up effectively. It's a really interesting kind of thing that's developing between the two characters. Now let's see, anything else that I want to point out for this chapter? No, just, you know, the girls that tried his horrible cooking were in love with it. That was weird. Any other things? Let me think. Oh no, yeah, I remember now. In this chapter, we might get a glimpse of the future because we're told about a competition, the Blue, where it's people from all over the world, and that's pretty good. Like, we have to remember, these guys are in their second or third year. I think second year. They're in their second year, I think, or maybe towards the upper half of the first. Either way, they're there, you know, they're relatively experienced, and we are hearing about all these competitions. So it'll be very interesting to see if our current cast of characters will ever hit those kind of global levels of going out, or yeah, going against people from all over the world. It'd be really neat. That's a very neat goal to have for the future of this series. I think then we can see more unique characters coming out, and we can continue the series going. So I want to think that the Blue is a sign of maybe things that we might see in the future with Soma. Maybe he'll go to these competitions. Anyway, I really love the chapter. Very good. It really makes you think, and there's a lot of interpretations that you could take as to why Saiba is the way he is. But yeah, you guys, let me know what you thought of this chapter. Saiba's a badass. And yeah, I think I'll end it there. Till next time, I hope you have a great day.